The video for today will be a bit different from my usual weekday videos. Today being Pearl Harbor Day, I wanted to do something related to that attack. Like my week of Pearl Harbor videos last December, which feels a lot longer away now than I thought it would. But I digress. As a result, we have this video. This will be a short look at the 5 longest-lived Pearl Harbor survivors. That being the ships, not the sailors. I won't go terribly in depth on any of these examples. I'll briefly go over their actions that day and how they met their end. If they had a particularly interesting career, I'll also put a couple notes about that. That being said, this video is something of a backup. I have a much longer video on USS California coming soon. Saturday or Tuesday, depending. But I didn't have time to get that out for Pearl Harbor Day. It ended up being quite a bit longer than I expected, as I kept finding interesting things to put in the script. It's coming, just delayed a little bit. For now, let's get into this video, beginning with number 5. Our number 5 ship for today is USS St. Louis, one of the Brooklyn class of light cruisers. Although, alongside her sister Helena, St. Louis is considered a subclass. Her secondary battery was carried in twin gun mounts instead of open single mounts. Her engine rooms were also arranged in a different way. At the core, however, she wasn't that different from her sisters. 13,500 tons at her full load, carrying no fewer than 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets. Quite heavily armed, as her class would demonstrate over the course of the war. For the purposes of this video, however, I'll focus on Pearl Harbor and her post-war career. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, USS St. Louis was one of the first ships to spot the Japanese attackers. Her gunners were, similarly, some of the first to engage the enemy. Over the course of the battle, her crew claimed 3 kills on Japanese planes. More importantly, though, she was quick to get underway. St. Louis began warming her boilers as early as 8:06 that morning, only 10 minutes after they saw the attackers. By 9:31, the ship was underway. Not the quickest to get underway, but not slow either. In any case, the cruiser escaped the attack undamaged. That left her as one of the relatively few ships capable of searching for the Japanese carriers. Unsuccessfully, as it turned out, with St. Louis returning to Pearl Harbor on December 10th. For the remainder of the war, St. Louis would be on the front line, often damaged, sometimes quite heavily, but never sunk. She would fight against Japanese surface forces and aircraft, earning, in the end, 11 battle stars for her efforts. She isn't quite as well known as her sister Helena, but not for lack of trying. That said, after the war, St. Louis was quickly put in reserve on June 20th, 1946. Her time in reserve would be quite short, as these things go. The ship was stricken from the Navy list on January 22nd, 1951, before being transferred to the Brazilian Navy on January 29th. Under her new name of Almirante Tamandaré, you'll have to forgive my Portuguese there, the cruiser would have a long career in South America. This was, after all, the period where surplus American warships were spread all over the globe for decades. In fact, most of the navies of this period were using some form of American ship. Unlike a later ship on this list, however, this cruiser would not see real combat. After a long career as Brazilian flagship, the ex-USS St. Louis was removed from Brazilian service in 1976. She would ultimately sink under tow to Taiwan for scrapping, on August 24th, 1980. Our number 4 ship would only outlast St. Louis by a year, as it turns out. USS Solace, a hospital ship, is an interesting case. She was, of course, unarmed. Her crew could not fight back during the Japanese attack. And yet she's one of the most famous ships involved that day, for reasons entirely unrelated to actually fighting. As a fairly small hospital ship, Solace was never going to be glamorous or famous. She was destined to be well away from actual combat, helping save the lives of wounded men. A good job, but not one that writes headlines. Then the attack on Pearl Harbor came about. While Solace could not fight back, and was not damaged in turn, her crew would become famous. Mostly because an Army doctor, Eric Hawkinson, and I apologize if I butcher that name, happened to be filming USS Arizona. At the moment of her explosion, creating some of the most well-known film in history. It was his film that showed the violence of Arizona's explosion in stark detail. Beyond that, Solace's crew would immediately set about rescuing survivors from the burning battleship, as well as the other sunken and damaged ships. Many lives were saved by the prompt, and extremely dangerous, it must be said, actions of Solace's crew. Such would be her story for the remainder of the war. While never exposed to quite as much direct danger ever again, the ship and her crew continue to save lives. Many thousands of men owe their lives to the actions of USS Solace. However, in the drawdowns at the end of the war, the ship was quickly decommissioned. Leaving active service on March 27, 1946, Solace was quickly sold off. By 1948, she was operating as a Turkish liner under the name of SS Ankara, where she would remain until being scrapped in 1981. Now, the number 3 ship on this list is probably the most famous, admittedly mostly because of her unfortunate end. That ship was USS Phoenix. Another Brooklyn-class cruiser, she was one of the original design compared to St. Louis's modified model. Laid down in 1935 and launched in 1938, Phoenix is broadly similar to the earlier example. The only major differences came in her single-mounted 5-inch guns and her different engine room layout. As for her actions during the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was, again, fairly similar to St. Louis. She spotted the attackers early and opened fire soon after the first bombs fell. Her engineering crew was quick to get the ship underway, with the cruiser capable of moving by 8:45. She ultimately suffered no damage in the attack. This left her, alongside St. Louis, as one of the most modern ships capable of heading out after the attack. It was also an indication of how Phoenix's career would go. Never the most famous ship, but she gave reliable service without ever suffering major damage. That's not a bad thing, especially for all the men who served aboard her without being injured or killed. This is, however, partially why Phoenix is better known for how she ended than how she lived. Decommissioned and put in reserve in early 1946, the ship was eventually sold to Argentina on April 9, 1951. While St. Louis would have a quiet career in Brazil, Phoenix would not be the same. Under her second Argentine name of ARA General Belgrano, the cruiser was part of the Argentine fleet during the Falklands War. What had been a charmed life in American service and a quiet career in Argentina ended in destruction. Specifically, on May 2, 1982, General Belgrano was torpedoed by HMS Conqueror. With her sinking in 1982, the ex-USS Phoenix is the longest-lived survivor of Pearl Harbor that is not a museum ship. Our final examples come in two small ships, the much more famous USCGC Taney and the less famous tugboat Hoga, or rather, WHEC 37 and Hoga since 2020. These two ships are both museum ships and are together the last survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack. The cutter formerly known as Taney engaged the Japanese during that attack within a few minutes of it beginning. While the coasties didn't really affect the attack much, the Japanese pilots did steer clear of her fire, which, I grant you, is about the most you could expect from 4 3-inch guns and some machine guns. After the attack's conclusion, the cutter set out of the harbor on anti-submarine patrol duty. This would be her job into early 1942, seeing many false sightings and depth charge attacks. Her real claim to fame, aside from Pearl Harbor, came in April of 1944. On April 20th, she was escorting a convoy when it was attacked by German aircraft. While the cutter escaped undamaged, the same couldn't be said for the convoy. Multiple ships were damaged, and 2 were sunk. Other than this air attack and downing some kamikazes off Okinawa, her career was rather quiet during the war. That being said, the cutter remained in service post-war until December 7th, 1986, at which point the old cutter was turned over to Baltimore, Maryland as a museum ship, where she remains to this day. As for Hoga as a harbor tug, her only real excitement was at Pearl Harbor. Within 10 minutes of the attack starting, the little tug was underway and helping pull Vestal away from the burning Arizona. She then assisted in pulling Oglala away from Helena before moving to push Nevada towards shore. Then it was firefighting duty up and down Battleship Row. The tug kept herself busy during the attack for sure. She would spend the rest of the war after the attack supporting salvage operations in the harbor. After the war ended, the tug was transferred to the port of Oakland as a fireboat in 1948. There she would remain under the names Port of Oakland and City of Oakland for 40 years, which was a long and successful career by all accounts. That said, by the late 1980s, the city was looking for a more modern ship. The tugboat was eventually returned to the Navy in 1994, after she had already been declared a National Historic Landmark in 1989. Hoga languished in reserve for some time after returning to Navy hands, until in 2005, the old tug was finally given over to a museum. Little Rock, Arkansas was the lucky town, and while it would take until 2015 to arrive, Hoga has remained there ever since. With that being said, this list comes to an end. Most of the survivors of Pearl Harbor were gone by the early 1980s. And yet, 2 unassuming little ships have survived all the way to the modern day. Maybe not the most famous of ships, but still good to have around. As a final note, for those curious, the last Japanese survivor of the attack was the destroyer Ushio. This little destroyer survived the war before ultimately being scrapped in 1948. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.